Sarah Martinez had never imagined that falling in love would put her life in danger. She was 23 years old when she first met Joseph Running Bear at the University Library in Montana. She was studying to become a teacher, and he was working toward his degree in environmental science. Joseph was quiet and thoughtful, with kind eyes that seemed to hold the wisdom of his ancestors. He belonged to the Crow Nation, one of the Native American tribes that had called Montana home for generations. Their love story began like many others. They met over borrowed books and shared coffee in the campus cafeteria. Sarah was drawn to Joseph's gentle nature and his deep connection to the land. He told her stories about his grandmother's teachings and the sacred places where his people had lived for hundreds of years. Joseph was equally captivated by Sarah's passion for education and her genuine interest in learning about his culture. When they decided to get married in 1952, it was a time when such unions were not widely accepted. Many people in their small Montana town had strong feelings against marriages between white women and Native American men. Sarah's own family had cut off contact with her when she announced her engagement. Her father had shouted terrible words and slammed the door in her face. Her mother had cried and begged her to reconsider, but Sarah's heart was set. The young couple moved to a small house near the reservation where Joseph's family lived. Sarah worked as a school teacher in the nearby town, while Joseph found work as a forest guide for tourists who wanted to learn about the local wildlife and native traditions. They were happy together, building a simple but meaningful life. However, their happiness was constantly shadowed by the hostility they faced from certain members of the community. Some of the white townspeople whispered cruel things when Sarah walked down the main street. They called her a squaw lover and other hateful names. Store owners sometimes refused to serve her, and some parents even demanded that she be fired from her teaching position because they didn't want their children taught by a native's wife. Joseph's family had welcomed Sarah with open arms, but even within the reservation, there were those who questioned whether she truly belonged. Some of the older tribal members worried that white people were slowly taking away their traditions and way of life. They feared that marriages like Joseph and Sarah's were just another way for their culture to disappear. Despite these challenges, Sarah threw herself into learning about Crow customs and language. She spent hours with Joseph's grandmother, who taught her how to prepare traditional foods and shared stories about the old days. Sarah learned to speak basic Crow phrases and participated in community gatherings. She genuinely wanted to be part of Joseph's world, not to change it, but to honor it. The trouble began when a severe drought hit the region in the summer of 1954. Crops failed, and many families struggled to find enough water for their basic needs. Old wells dried up, and tempers grew short as people competed for the remaining water sources. During times of hardship, people often look for someone to blame, and unfortunately, Sarah became an easy target. A group of angry white men from town began spreading rumors that the drought was somehow connected to Sarah's presence in their community. They claimed that her marriage to Joseph was an insult to God and nature, and that the land was punishing them all for allowing such a union to exist. These were ignorant and superstitious beliefs, but desperate people sometimes accept foolish explanations when they're looking for answers. The leader of this group was a man named Bill Crawford, who owned a large cattle ranch that had been hit hard by the drought. He had lost many of his animals and was facing financial ruin. Crawford had always harbored racist views against Native Americans, and now he had found a way to direct his anger and frustration towards Sarah. He convinced several other men that taking action against the native's wife would somehow restore the natural order and bring back the rains. Sarah first sensed the growing danger when she noticed groups of men gathering outside her workplace and following her home from school. Joseph became increasingly worried about her safety and tried to convince her to stay on the reservation where his family could protect her. But Sarah was stubborn and didn't want to let fear control her life. She continued her daily routines, hoping that the tension would eventually pass. One evening in late July, as Sarah was walking home from the school where she had stayed late to prepare lessons for the next day, she noticed a group of 5 men blocking the road ahead of her. She recognized Bill Crawford and some of his ranch hands, along with a few other men she had seen around town. Their faces were hard and angry, and she could smell alcohol on their breath as they approached her. Crawford stepped forward and spoke in a voice filled with hatred. He told Sarah that she was no longer welcome in their community and that her unnatural marriage was bringing a curse upon their land. He said that decent white women didn't associate with savages, and that she had brought shame upon her entire race. The other men nodded and muttered their agreement, their hands resting on the ropes and tools they carried at their belts. Sarah tried to remain calm and asked them to let her pass. She explained that she had done nothing wrong and that she just wanted to go home to her husband. But Crawford laughed coldly and said that going home wasn't an option anymore. He told her that they had found a fitting place for traitors like her, somewhere deep and dark where she wouldn't be able to spread her poison anymore. The men grabbed Sarah's arms and began dragging her toward an old pickup truck parked nearby. She screamed for help, but the road was empty, and her voice seemed to disappear into the vast Montana landscape. As they forced her into the truck, Crawford explained their terrible plan. There was an old well on his property that had collapsed during a recent storm. The opening was deep and narrow, perfect for disposing of someone who had outlived her welcome. He said that when people asked what had happened to the school teacher, they would simply say she had run off with some traveling salesman, too ashamed to show her face in town anymore. Sarah felt terror unlike anything she had ever experienced. These men were serious about their deadly intentions, and she was completely helpless in their hands. As the truck bounced along the dusty roads toward Crawford's ranch, she prayed that somehow Joseph would realize she was missing and come looking for her. But she also knew that by the time he discovered her absence, it might already be too late. The collapsed well sat in a remote corner of Crawford's property, hidden from view by a stand of cottonwood trees. As they dragged her from the truck, Sarah could see the dark opening in the ground, like a mouth waiting to swallow her forever. The men had brought ropes and shovels, planning to throw her into the hole and then fill it with dirt and rocks so that her body would never be found. Crawford pushed Sarah to her knees at the edge of the well and told her to look down into her final resting place. The hole seemed to stretch down into endless darkness, and Sarah could hear the sound of water trickling far below. She realized that even if the fall didn't kill her immediately, she would either drown or starve to death in that terrible place. As the men prepared their ropes and argued about the best way to complete their horrible task, Sarah closed her eyes and thought about Joseph. She remembered their wedding day and how happy they had been. She thought about all the dreams they had shared and the children they had hoped to have someday. It seemed impossible that their love story would end in such a cruel and senseless way. But even in her darkest moment, Sarah refused to give up hope. She knew that Joseph was a skilled tracker who had learned traditional hunting techniques from his grandfather. If anyone could find her in time, it would be him. She just had to stay alive long enough for him to reach her, and she had to believe that love was stronger than hate. Joseph Running Bear knew something was wrong the moment he arrived home and found the house empty. Sarah always left a note when she planned to be late, and dinner was usually waiting on the stove. Tonight, the kitchen was cold and dark, and her school bag was nowhere to be found. He called her name throughout the small house, checking every room twice, but the silence that greeted him filled his heart with dread. His first instinct was to check with the school, but when he arrived there, the building was locked and empty. The janitor told him that Miss Martinez had stayed late to work on her lesson plans, but had left around sunset. That had been 3 hours ago, and the walk from the school to their house should have taken only 20 minutes. Joseph drove the route between the school and home several times, searching the roadside with a flashlight for any sign of his wife. His grandfather had taught him to read the land like a book, and he noticed several sets of tire tracks in the dust, where cars had stopped and turned around. There were also footprints in the soft earth near the road, including what looked like the marks of a struggle. Growing more worried by the minute, Joseph decided to visit his Uncle Robert, who lived on the reservation and often heard gossip from both the native and white communities. Robert was sitting on his porch when Joseph arrived, and he could see the concern in his nephew's face before Joseph even spoke. Robert had indeed heard disturbing rumors that day. Some of the native men who worked in town had overheard angry conversations at the local bar. White ranchers were blaming the drought on all sorts of things, including the presence of mixed marriages in their community. There was talk of taking action to restore the natural order, though Robert hadn't taken the threat seriously until now. Joseph felt his blood run cold as he realized that Sarah's disappearance was not random. Someone had taken her deliberately, and her life was in immediate danger. He asked Robert to gather some of the other men from the reservation while he tried to track down more information about who might be responsible. Joseph's next stop was at the home of Mary Henderson, an elderly white woman who had always been kind to Sarah and who often heard gossip from other women in town. Mary was shocked to learn that Sarah was missing and immediately told Joseph about the group of men who had been gathering at Bill Crawford's ranch. She had heard her neighbor talking about how Crawford was planning to solve the Indian problem once and for all. Armed with this information, Joseph raced back to the reservation where Robert had assembled 6 strong men who were ready to help search for Sarah. Among them was James Wolfe Child, an older man who had served in the Korean War and understood tactics and strategy. James suggested that they split into 2 groups, one to search Crawford's ranch while the other checked other possible locations. However, time was running short, and Joseph's instincts told him that Crawford's ranch was the most likely place to find Sarah. Crawford had been the most vocal opponent of their marriage and had the means and motivation to carry out such a terrible plan. Joseph decided to scout the ranch alone while the others spread out to cover more ground. Crawford's ranch covered several thousand acres of rough terrain, with countless places where someone could hide a victim. Joseph parked his truck a mile away and approached on foot, using the skills his grandfather had taught him for moving silently through the wilderness. The moon was nearly full, providing enough light for him to navigate without using a flashlight that might give away his position. As he moved across the ranch property, Joseph listened carefully for any sounds that might indicate human activity. He heard cattle lowing in the distance and the hoot of an owl, but nothing that suggested where Sarah might be held. He knew that he needed to be systematic in his search, but every minute that passed increased the danger to his wife. Joseph had been searching for nearly an hour when he finally heard voices coming from a grove of cottonwood trees near the eastern boundary of the ranch. He crept closer and could make out the shapes of several men standing around what appeared to be a hole in the ground. His heart nearly stopped when he recognized Crawford's voice giving orders to the other men. Hidden behind a large boulder about 50 yards away, Joseph strained to hear what the men were saying. Crawford was telling someone to bring more rope, and another man was complaining about how deep the hole was. Then Joseph heard a sound that made his blood freeze. Sarah's voice, weak but unmistakably alive, pleading with the men not to hurt her. Joseph realized that his wife was being held at the edge of an old well, and the men were preparing to throw her into it. He was outnumbered 5-1, and the men were armed with rifles and handguns. A direct assault would likely get both him and Sarah killed, but he couldn't wait for backup to arrive. Every moment of delay brought his wife closer to death. Drawing on his military training and traditional hunting wisdom, Joseph formulated a desperate plan. He would create a distraction that would scatter the men and give him a chance to reach Sarah. He gathered several large rocks and began throwing them in different directions around the grove, making it sound like multiple people were approaching from various angles. The men immediately became agitated and began looking around nervously. Crawford shouted orders for his companions to spread out and investigate the sounds, but the men were clearly frightened and confused. In the darkness, they couldn't tell how many people might be surrounding them or what kind of weapons their enemies might have. Joseph's distraction worked better than he had hoped. 3 of the men grabbed their rifles and headed off in different directions to investigate the sounds, leaving only Crawford and 1 ranch hand to guard Sarah. This was Joseph's chance, but he would have to act quickly before the scattered men regrouped. Moving like a shadow through the tall grass, Joseph circled around to approach the well from the side where Sarah was being held. He could see her more clearly now, kneeling at the edge of the collapsed well with her hands tied behind her back. Crawford was standing over her with a pistol in his hand, while his companion was preparing a rope to lower her into the hole. Joseph knew he would have only 1 chance to save his wife. He picked up a heavy piece of fallen timber and waited for the perfect moment to strike. When Crawford turned his back to shout instructions to the ranch hand, Joseph exploded from his hiding place and brought the timber down on the man's head with all his strength. Crawford collapsed instantly, his pistol flying into the darkness. The ranch hand spun around in surprise and reached for his own weapon, but Joseph was already on top of him. Years of hard physical work had made Joseph strong, and his desperation to save Sarah gave him even greater power. He wrestled the man to the ground and knocked him unconscious with a blow to the jaw. Sarah was sobbing with relief as Joseph quickly cut the ropes that bound her hands and helped her to her feet. She was bruised and terrified, but otherwise unharmed. Joseph held her close for a moment, but they both knew they couldn't celebrate yet. The other 3 men would return soon, and Joseph and Sarah needed to get away before that happened. Supporting his shaken wife, Joseph led her quickly through the grove toward where he had hidden his truck. Behind them, they could hear the voices of the returning men as they discovered their unconscious companions and realized that their prisoner had escaped. Angry shouts echoed through the night as the men began searching for Joseph and Sarah. The couple reached Joseph's truck just as they heard the sound of engines starting up back at the well. Crawford's men had regained consciousness and were organizing a pursuit. Joseph helped Sarah into the truck and drove as fast as he dared across the rough ranch roads, his headlights cutting through the darkness as they raced toward safety. As they bounced along the dirt roads leading away from Crawford's ranch, Sarah finally felt safe enough to tell Joseph what had happened. She described how the men had grabbed her on her way home from school and revealed their terrible plan to throw her into the well. She also told him about the cruel things they had said about their marriage and their belief that she was somehow responsible for the drought. Joseph listened with growing anger as his wife described her ordeal, but he was also filled with relief that he had found her in time. He knew that they weren't safe yet, though. Crawford and his men were likely following them, and they would probably contact the local sheriff to report that Indians had attacked them on their own property. In 1954, the word of white ranchers carried much more weight with law enforcement than the testimony of a Native American man and his wife. Joseph drove straight to the reservation, knowing that his family and community would provide protection while they figured out their next steps. When they arrived at his Uncle Robert's house, the men who had been searching for Sarah were gathered on the porch, waiting anxiously for news. The relief on their faces when they saw Sarah alive and safe was overwhelming. Robert immediately took charge of the situation, understanding the serious legal and safety implications of what had happened. He sent 2 men to stand guard at the entrance to the reservation, while others were dispatched to contact tribal leaders and the few white allies they trusted in the surrounding communities. Everyone knew that Crawford would not simply accept defeat and might try to retaliate. Sarah was taken inside where the women of the community tended to her injuries and provided comfort. Joseph's grandmother, who was nearly 80 years old but still sharp and strong, held Sarah's hands and spoke to her in both English and Crow. She told Sarah that she had shown great courage and that the spirits had guided Joseph to find her because their love was blessed and true. While the women cared for Sarah, the men discussed their options. They all agreed that going to the local sheriff would be useless and possibly dangerous. Sheriff Morrison had never hidden his dislike for Native Americans and would likely believe Crawford's version of events over theirs. They needed to find another way to ensure Sarah's safety and hold her attackers accountable. Robert suggested contacting the federal authorities, since crimes against Native Americans on reservation land fell under federal jurisdiction. There was also the possibility of reaching out to newspaper reporters in the larger cities who might be interested in a story about attempted murder, motivated by racial hatred. Public attention could provide protection that the local law enforcement would not. However, their immediate concern was Crawford's likely response to being humiliated and defeated. Men like Crawford did not forgive or forget such incidents, and he had the resources and connections to make life very difficult for Joseph and Sarah. The community leaders decided that the couple should leave the area temporarily while they worked to build a case against Crawford and ensure their long-term safety. Joseph was reluctant to leave his homeland and family, but he also knew that staying would put not only himself and Sarah at risk, but potentially the entire reservation community. Crawford was the kind of man who might organize reprisals against all Native Americans in the region if he couldn't get revenge against Joseph specifically. The next morning brought unexpected news that changed everything. Mary Henderson, the elderly white woman who had helped Joseph find Sarah, arrived at the reservation with two other white women from town. They had come to offer their testimony about what they had witnessed and heard regarding Crawford's plans. Mary explained that she and several other women had been horrified to learn about the attempted murder and wanted to help ensure that justice was done. They had also brought word that not everyone in the white community supported Crawford's actions. Many people were shocked and disgusted when they learned what had really happened, and some were willing to speak out against Crawford and his companions. This development gave Robert hope that they might be able to pursue justice through proper channels after all. With white witnesses willing to testify about Crawford's threats and plans, they would have a much stronger case to present to federal authorities. Mary also revealed that Crawford's own ranch hands were beginning to talk about what their boss had made them do, and at least one was willing to cooperate with law enforcement. The tribal council convened that afternoon to discuss the situation and decide on the best course of action. After much deliberation, they decided to contact the FBI field office in Billings and request a federal investigation into the attempted murder and kidnapping. They would also reach out to civil rights organizations that were beginning to emerge in the aftermath of World War II. Sarah insisted on participating in these discussions despite her ordeal. She had recovered much of her strength and was determined to see her attackers held accountable. She also wanted to make sure that other interracial couples in the region would not face similar dangers. Her courage and determination impressed the tribal elders and strengthened their resolve to fight for justice. 3 days after the incident, FBI agent Thomas Wright arrived on the reservation to begin his investigation. Agent Wright was a fair-minded man who had experience dealing with civil rights cases, and he took Sarah's account seriously. He also interviewed the white witnesses who had come forward and began building a comprehensive case against Crawford and his accomplices. The investigation revealed that Crawford's group had been planning their attack for several weeks and had specifically targeted Sarah because they believed that eliminating her would send a message to other white women who might consider marrying Native American men. This evidence of premeditation and racial motivation strengthened the federal case significantly. Within 2 weeks, Crawford and 4 of his accomplices were arrested and charged with kidnapping, attempted murder, and civil rights violations. The arrests sent shockwaves through the local community and divided public opinion sharply. While some people continued to support Crawford, many others were appalled by his actions and began to question their own prejudices. The trial took place 6 months later in federal court, with Sarah providing powerful testimony about her ordeal. Joseph also testified about finding his wife at the well and rescuing her from certain death. The white witnesses who came forward proved crucial in establishing Crawford's guilt and contradicting his claims of innocence. Crawford was ultimately sentenced to 20 years in federal prison, while his accomplices received sentences ranging from 5 to 12 years. The judge made it clear that crimes motivated by racial hatred would be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law, sending a strong message to others who might consider similar actions. The aftermath of the trial brought significant changes to the community. Many white residents began to examine their own attitudes toward Native Americans and interracial relationships. Some made efforts to reach out to the reservation community and build bridges of understanding. The incident had forced people to confront the ugly reality of racism in their midst. For Joseph and Sarah, the experience strengthened their marriage and their commitment to fighting prejudice through education and example. Sarah continued teaching and eventually became a principal, while Joseph became an advocate for Native American rights and education. They had 3 children who grew up proud of their mixed heritage and committed to promoting understanding between different communities. The couple remained in Montana for the rest of their lives, building a legacy of courage and love that inspired others facing similar challenges. Sarah learned to speak Crow fluently and became deeply involved in preserving traditional stories and customs. Joseph used his education to help establish programs that brought economic development to the reservation while respecting traditional ways of life. Years later, when their children asked about the night at the well, Sarah would tell them that she had learned something important about the power of love and community. She explained that while hatred and fear could drive people to terrible acts, love and courage could overcome even the darkest moments. Joseph would add that the spirits of his ancestors had guided him to find her because their love was part of something larger than themselves. The old well on Crawford's former ranch was eventually filled in and forgotten, but the story of what happened there became part of local history. It served as a reminder of how quickly civilization could break down when people gave in to their worst impulses, but also of how individual acts of courage could triumph over hatred and violence. Sarah and Joseph's marriage became a symbol of hope for other interracial couples in the region, proving that love could survive even the most serious challenges. Their story spread beyond Montana, inspiring others who faced discrimination and prejudice in their own communities. They showed that standing up for what was right, even when it was dangerous, could create positive change that lasted for generations. In the end, the night that should have ended Sarah's life instead became the beginning of a new chapter for their entire community. The attempted murder forced people to confront their prejudices and choose between hate and understanding. While not everyone changed their minds, enough people chose compassion to create a more tolerant and just society for future generations. The collapsed well that was meant to be Sarah's grave instead became a symbol of how love and courage could overcome the deepest darkness. Joseph's desperate rescue of his wife proved that some bonds are stronger than hatred, and some love stories are powerful enough to change the world around them.